Let's say that you go to a store, to a hospital, to a show, and you see a picket line of people who, for labor reasons, don't want you to enter the building. Most of us, or perhaps not all of us in this room, but most people would say, well, this has got nothing to do with me. And some of us might even say, well, I have some sympathy with the non-union workers. They need jobs too. But think if that was your job, that you had a problem that your boss cut your pay to increase his bonus. Would your sympathy for the non-union workers be quite as strong? Indeed, the replacement workers receive less money than the job normally pays, so they're exploited too. The problems of other workers in our society are our problems as well. Now, the Unitarian faith has 7 principles. 3 of them apply today. One is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Another is the pursuit of justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And the 5th principle is the use of the democratic process within our congregations and within society at large. Unions exemplify this for us. So the way we should look at this, in my opinion, is that we should try to figure out what makes an economic transaction just. Whether you're buying something or you're selling something, or whether you're going to do work for somebody, the relationship should result in decent compensation on both sides. Indeed, classic economic theory says that both sides should be richer after the transaction occurs. That's why we do transactions. And in order for those transactions to be fair, each side should have an equal ability to say no. And of course, when you're starving or when your mortgage is due, your ability to say no decreases. So what matters for us in evaluating economic transactions is the equity of power. That equity of power is the model that I hope to focus on. Because when the bosses and labor have similar degrees of power in our society, then they come up with a just economic transaction that hopefully benefits everybody. And the benefit for everybody is what we should all be about. Now, the least equitable economic transaction that I can imagine is slavery. Slavery not only means that the boss doesn't have to pay you, but the boss owns you and your children as well. That, of course, is extreme exploitation. Serfdom or peasantry is not much better. You may not belong to the boss, but the boss owns the land and you're tied to the land. You're not allowed to leave the land, so you have to work the land, so you don't have any negotiating power. About 1,000 years ago, through various struggles with the nobility, we started creating yeoman workers, people who had a little more power. They were still doing work that they had very little control over, but they had the ability to leave the land and go seek work elsewhere. And that gave them a little more negotiating room, a little more power, a little closer to equity. Now, the yeoman workers bred the craftsmen, people like stonemasons and carpenters and weavers. These were people with specialized skills that did things that varied between one person and the other. One weaver might not do as well as the other weaver. And that created a personal differentiation which allowed the good weavers to seek more work, more pay. Still, they didn't have a lot of power, so they created guilds, which essentially were primitive unions. And the purpose of the guilds was to limit the labor pool to increase the negotiation power of the worker. The rich were willing to tolerate this as long as the work done by these craftsmen was not a major fraction of the economy. If 5% of the workers got a decent pay rate and 95% of them still got screwed, that was okay with the rich. So it was a small fraction of economic activity. A lot of the workers didn't like this arrangement, so they started setting up. Then the Industrial Revolution occurs. And some of the work, most particularly weaving and spinning, become mechanized so that everybody can do them, and the personal differentiation, the difference in measurable achievement, take it easy, Gozer, becomes lower, and that in turn increases the negotiation power of the bosses and the owners. Since there's no differentiation, they're highly interchangeable employees, less power. To make it even worse, the bosses started doing something that is most obvious when you look at England and in the United States. They deliberately maximize the labor pool to minimize the negotiation power of the workers. You can think of the enclosures of the farms in England, which drove people into the cities looking for industrial work. Or in the United States, you've heard about the bosses advertising in places like Poland and England and China and Italy to get workers to come here. Free, lots of jobs, come here, lots of work. Well, of course, more workers, more competition, less power for the workers. So there was a manipulation of the market by the bosses to create power for them, which minimizes the equity for the workers. So the workers got a little upset. They started setting up unions. The unions were hard to set up. They were hard to win, but eventually the unions get set up. The unionized worker is still doing interchangeable work. I mean, if you're shoveling coal into a furnace, you can't do that a whole lot better if you're skilled than if you're not, because the furnace only wants so many pounds an hour. But the purpose of the unions is to create a enforced limitation on the labor pool, which decreases the power of the bosses, increases the power of the union workers, and we come closer to equity. Now, mind you, there are a couple situations where the unions got more power than the workers, but not a whole lot of them. Now, many of us are professional workers. We do work that is highly individual. One lawyer can do work a lot better than another lawyer. One doctor can cure you better than another doctor. So that measurable achievement creates personal differentiation, which creates more power for the ones that are skilled and less power for the ones that are not skilled. To magnify that difference, professions created certification. There's certification for professional accountants. There's the bar for lawyers. There's the boards for medical doctors. By making it hard to get into the profession, you reduce the labor pool, which increases the negotiation power of the professionals, and some of the lawyers and some of the doctors are among the highest paid people in our society. Now, I was a member of 2 unions. When I was going through college, I was a member of Teamsters Local 575, working in a chemical plant. And when I was an inspector for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I was a member of the American Federation of Government Employees, number 1534. Now, government unions of that sort are house unions. They don't really have the power to negotiate employment. They don't have the power to negotiate salaries. But they do help you represent an employee in individual conflicts. So there is an increase in power, although it's not quite the same as being a member of the steelworkers. I'm not a member of the labor union now. I think that they've been very good to me, but I am not. So why do unions have power? Well, it's always coercion. There's a few, maybe 16 employers in the United States who really love the idea of having a union and encourage one to form. But in general, most employers are coerced into having unions. Now, originally, the coercion took the form of threats of violence against the strikebreakers. You cross our picket line, we beat you up, or even worse. There was also a threat of sabotage to the property of the owners, the employers. Though that threat consisted in the little steel in placing gimmicks in the devices that would cause them to break if the strikebreakers came and operated them. And eventually, of course, the union takes them out when they win. Later, the form of coercion was a threat of governmental intervention with the introduction of the National Labor Relations Board, which, as I said in May, has been severely limited in the last 10 or 15 years. It's really hard to win an NLRB election nowadays. Now, consistent with the fourth principle of Unitarian religion, which, by the way, is the search for truth together, us helping each other to learn, I realized there were at least two members of our congregation who have been in the role of employers in Atlantic County. I spoke to TJ and to Jeff, both of whom had different viewpoints on the labor unions. I thought it was important for me to take those into account. And we'll talk about what they said in a moment. So I want you to realize that in general, I think unions are a good thing. But every good thing's got two sides. As an example, I think marriage is a wonderful thing. And I'm glad I'm married. But I'll bet you there's at least two people in this room who are glad they got divorced. So every institution has a negative side, and if you talk only about the negative side, you'll never see the positive. And you talk about the positive, you'll never see the negative. Now, the way unions work is that the workers who had a little bit of power come together to add their power together to approximate the power of the employer. But the employer does not want to negotiate with 100 or 5,000 employees, so you need some sort of figurehead, some sort of leader with whom that person negotiates. And it's not a really big surprise when that shop steward or a union local president decides, well, since I'm negotiating these benefits, I could take like 5% of the benefits for myself and give 95% to the workers. And they'd still make out pretty good. Well, sometimes it gets to be 10% and sometimes 20%. And so you wind up with union corruption. Leading a union can be a very remunerative activity. Probably not as remunerative as being a hedge fund manager, but definitely something that can pay off. For example, when I was a member of the Teamsters Union, one of the benefits that we had was educational counseling for members of the union. I thought that was a peculiar benefit until I realized that the person who did the educational counseling was the son-in-law of the union local president. So certainly there is corruption, and that question about what percent that focus person grabs is a big deal. There's also a problem with union work rules, and this is the thing that TJ, pretty much said drives him crazy. You do some work on a union site, and you're doing work that's either covered or not covered, and you want to put up a frame, but there's two screws that are in tin. And that's a tin worker's job, so you got to wait for the tin worker to show up. When I was working in OSHA, I did an inspection at a Bethlehem steel plant in Buffalo, New York, and I was expecting the shop steward to be a supporter of health and safety. But he didn't want to talk about health and safety. He considered his job to be enforcing the work rule that said that no supervisor was allowed to do work that was covered by the union contract. And what he liked to do mostly was win an award to the worker who should have done the work if a supervisor had done that work. So a supervisor lifts a bale that he's not supposed to, the union worker gets 4 hours pay. And that's what he focused on, which doesn't, it's good for the worker, but it doesn't represent overall justice for everybody. Also, unions tend to protect the incompetent. One of my friends from OSHA told me a story that there was a supervisor at Curtiss Aircraft in Fairfield, New Jersey, who found one of his workers sleeping in a stall in a men's room. The guy was supposed to be working. He wasn't on a break or anything like that. He was just goofing off. Now, this is a charge that should cause discipline or maybe even firing, depending on the rules. The shop steward thought quick and said, well, I'm going to spread a rumor that the reason that supervisor was looking in the men's room stall was that he hoped to see something private and sexual. Now, we can deal with that homophobia about this old story later, but the point was that the company backed down on the discipline of somebody who really had done something wrong because the union had decided to protect that person. Now, actually, this protection of the incompetent extends to the protection of the venal, somebody who's done something wrong. And I think that the blue wall of silence that you hear when we engage with police abuses, most particularly of black people and Latin people, is related to this protection of the incompetent. That we're union, we stand together, we protect ourselves from the outsiders. So, as I said, there are some downsides, some concerns that I have about the unions. Another one is the protection of the lazy. Jeff told me the story that during the construction of the Trump Tower, the construction workers, who were union, found a way to build a nice little hidey hole. Actually, it wasn't all that little. And union workers could go there and take a 2-hour nap while they were on the clock, which, similar to the story about the worker in the aircraft factory, is stealing from the employer. And Jeff didn't tell me to what extent the bosses knew about the hidey hole, but certainly the union was taking steps to protect the workers who were stealing from the employer, which gets us back to the recognition that we're talking about relative degrees of power, not complete social justice. Social justice occurs when the power is about even. So we're not talking about one group of saints and another group of sinners. We're talking about two economic actors who are trying to serve themselves, who come to their best agreement when they're working together with some sort of equity between them. Now, even in the face of all of these problems, the unions have been responsible over the last century for creation of the 8-hour workday, for the end of child labor, which in turn created the success of the public school system, which in turn gave a lot of you jobs as teachers for which you needed unions. The unions helped us win employer-paid health care. They helped us fight discrimination in racial and religious terms, as is illustrated by the quote that Erica read. They helped us win pensions that help us avoid the extreme poverty that faced people who would retire from work or would no longer be able to work 100 years ago. So my bottom line is that I want you to recognize that most workers are somewhat interchangeable. Yes, one accountant can do a better job than another accountant, but you still need an accountant to do certain jobs. So since they're interchangeable, the power that they have in negotiating contracts may be small. And so we need to face the statement that Ben Franklin made when they signed the Declaration of Independence. We must hang together, or we shall surely hang separately. So even if you have an individual work reputation, your prosperity probably rests to some degree on the threat of unions. Even if you're in a job that's never had a union before, the idea that you get paid this much to be a doctor is based on the idea that if the other people in society were making 1/20th or 1/100th of what you're making, maybe they wouldn't have to pay you that much. So your prosperity does, to some degree, rest on the success of everybody else in our society. Also, I want to point out that the power dynamics that apply to employment apply to consumer rights. Indeed, the organization that publishes the Consumers Report is called the Consumers Union. And it's called that because they drew their inspiration from the creation of labor unions. The corporations and workers succeed best when they work together for success in the economic enterprise. We've talked about ways that the unions don't work that way. I think it's fair to say that you already know about employers who are not worried about everybody succeeding, just themselves. Indeed, one's running for president right now. So it's appropriate for the religious community to help both of them grow and cooperate in a moral context. What should you and I do? We should listen, we should learn, and we should educate each other about labor rights and economic equity. We should connect with labor groups. We should award the construction work for our own work at our houses or for our businesses or for the church to contractors that treat workers justly. Now, mind you, I didn't say labor union contractors. I said contractors that treat the workers justly. We should advocate for policies that protect all workers. I'm most mindful of the fight for $15 an hour as the minimum wage. As I said in May, the minimum wage that I earned when I was 18 is worth 50% more than the current minimum wage under federal law. We should support workers who are organizing for justice. We should shop ethically. We shouldn't buy the cheapest thing, particularly if we think it was produced by slave or vastly exploited labor. And we should pay and treat our own workers well. To you I say, let us strive for justice.